Hi, I'm Linda Katz-Wilner, founder and CEO of Successfully Speaking. I'm thrilled to have with me today for this interview Zachary Witkower, who is a PhD candidate in social psychology at the University of British Columbia. As full disclosure, Zachary Witkower is my nephew, but I've relied on him many a time for information for his field of study. And I'd like to welcome you, Zach, and talk to you a little bit about your background and what you do at the University of British Columbia.
Great. Yeah, it's so great to be here. So I'm a PhD student, as you said. I study facial expressions and bodily movement. I'm interested in how people express emotion, how they express personality, and how observers use these behaviors to form their impressions of others.
And we've talked a lot about this together because, as many people know, I work on the 3 V's of communication: the visual, how you look; the vocal, how you sound; and the verbal, what you say. And these 3 V's need to be in alignment for you to come across as professional and credible. And many a time, Zach and I have had conversations about the work that I do, and it's backed up by a lot of the research that you do as well. And I thought it would be a great opportunity to share some of your information with the audience today.
Sure.
So I talk about the 3 V's, the visual, the vocal, and the verbal. And as you've mentioned to me, we often break it down to just verbal and nonverbal communication. How does your body of research relate to the work that I do with my clients in the workforce?
So there's actually a lot of overlap. So I'm very interested in social status. And what I mean by social status is the way that people influence others. So there are actually 2 ways that people can influence others. On the one hand, you can use prestige, so communicating competence and knowledge and expertise in a subject matter, or you can use dominance, so using aggression and intimidation to elicit fear. So for the kinds of stuff that you're the most interested in, it's definitely things related to prestige. So the research that I've done most recently, we see that there are certain sets of behaviors that people engage in when they are prestigious, and observers use these behaviors to form their impressions of prestige of others. So for example, we see that prestigious individuals, they engage in more smiling, they'll tilt their head, they'll stand up tall, they'll communicate competence with their expansiveness, and when people see these behaviors, they actually form impressions of prestige. And if they're, for example, in a group task and they're trying to come to consensus on some sort of agreement, they'll defer to this prestigious person based on these nonverbal behaviors.
Now, you mentioned head tilt, because I know we've had a lot of conversations about this, and I've talked to a lot of my clients about this. What exactly do you mean by head tilt?
Sure, so there are lots of different ways that you can move the head. When I'm talking about head tilt, I'm talking about head pitch rotation, so this up-down movement. So it's actually a very strong signal of what I'll call dominance. So people perceive this to be aggressive and intimidating in certain situations. In other situations, it can communicate something very different. So for example, something else that is extremely important is eye gaze. So we see that a downwards head tilt with directed eye gaze can come across as very dominant. We also see that dominant individuals will use these behaviors when they're attacking others. So most recently, we had a case where Donald Trump, for example, in the presidential elections was attacking Hillary Clinton, and he engaged in a lot of these dominance behaviors. So in terms of head tilt, one of the things that I think is the most interesting is people often view facial expressions as this platform to communicate information, but you never see the face in isolation. You only see the face as it rests on the head. But despite this, most research, especially on facial expressions, even things like smiling, for example, they ignore the position of the head when they're talking about the face. So this becomes a problem because it can actually completely shift the message communicated from the face.
And that's interesting because we once had a disagreement in how we interpreted something, and I spoke about Princess Diana, who was known for her downward head tilt, but her upward gaze. And I asked you, why is that not considered aggressive or hostile? It was endearing. People loved her. So what was it about her? Was it the facial expression and not the head tilt that became important?
Absolutely. So even as you just did that there's this muscle in the forehead called frontalis. And frontalis is responsible for raising your eyebrows, and it runs across the entirety of your forehead. So you see that the muscles in the forehead get used differently, but when you, for example, raise the frontalis muscle while you're doing this head tilt behavior, it does change the aggressive signal that's communicated from head tilt.
So this is a lot for people to think
Yeah.
about. I'm thinking about job interviews.
Sure.
So you go to a job interview and you want to come across as confident. What are the things you should think of with your head tilt, your facial expression, your body language, or any of the nonverbal parts of the visual communication?
It's a great question. So I think the first thing that's the most important is making sure you're not trying to communicate competence and knowledge and expertise if it's something that you don't feel you necessarily have competence and knowledge and expertise in. So what I mean specifically there is if you're asked a specific question, and it's something you don't know the answer to. If you stand up and you make yourself appear really confident and competent, you might come across as arrogant if your verbal behaviors are not matching your nonverbal behaviors. But that said, if it is something that you do feel confident in and you do have knowledge and expertise, signaling your prestige to others can be very, very helpful. And to do this, there are probably 3 behaviors that I would recommend. So the first would be smiling, which communicates warmth, affiliation, approach. An upwards head tilt also helps. You see this a lot in pride expressions. And finally, expansiveness, but you're going to specifically want to sit up straight with your chest out.
And why is the upward head tilt pride and not arrogance?
Yeah, so interestingly, it's the same prototypical expression is used to communicate something called authentic pride, which is this achievement-oriented, successful sort of version of pride, and hubristic pride, which is this more arrogant and conceited form of pride. From the expression alone, it's very hard to disentangle them. That's why it's extremely important that you have the knowledge base when you're talking. So this is a situation where if you communicate pride, so with an upwards head tilt and a smile, but you don't really know what you're talking about, you're going to come across as arrogant. But that same expression, if you do know what you're talking about, you'll come across as prideful.
So that verbal does come into it. You need the verbal to match up with the visual and the vocal. as you're
Absolutely.
saying.
I think one of the most important things is to make sure that your verbal behaviors are matching your nonverbal behaviors.
So what about that quote, fake it until you make it, or fake it until you become it? Are
Yeah.
you opposed to that?
Am I opposed to it? What do you mean?
Well, do you think that that's being very inauthentic? I often tell people that it's important to look confident. Even if you may be nervous inside, you want to come across with good posture, good eye contact, good facial expression, so people perceive you as confident. But I certainly don't want to coach people to look arrogant.
Sure. Yeah, so a few important things. First of all, I never see a downside to eye contact. Eye contact is one of those things that making eye contact is never going to hurt you in most situations. The only time it could be inappropriate is if it comes across as flirtatious. In terms of smiling, smiling is something else, especially if you're on a job interview or you're talking to a group of people. It's never going to hurt you. It's only going to make you come across as warm and affiliative. It's specifically confidence signaling. So the idea that I know exactly what I'm talking about when you don't really know what you're talking about, it's only in those situations that you start to run into some issues.
Talk to me a little bit about the smile that isn't
Sure.
really the true smile. I know you've talked about that.
Sure, yeah. So it was actually, I believe it was a French scientist named Duchenne. So there are 2 primary muscles that are involved in smiling. There's the zygomatic major muscle, which causes your corners of your lips to go up. There's also orbicularis oculi, which is this circular muscle. It has several rings. It's the outer portion of orbicularis oculi. So activation of these muscles cause not only the smiling, but you also see crow's feet wrinkles around the eyes. So the crow's feet wrinkles around the eyes, Paul Ekman, who is one of the most innovative nonverbal behavioral scientists, argued that it's extremely hard to fake this. So these muscles cannot easily be activated unless you're genuinely happy. So because of this, it's often believed that you can actually pick up on if someone's signaling happiness versus genuinely experiencing happiness based on these crow's feet wrinkles that are around the eyes. A lot of people call it smizing.
Smizing.
Smiling with your eyes.
Right. And to think when I was in my master's program in speech pathology that we had to study the anatomy and physiology of the face and know all those muscles, to think I'd be focusing on that now when I'm analyzing how other people look or helping them be sincere, right, and smile and not worry about those crow's feet that some of us might have, because that shows the authentic
Absolutely.
smile. Because I know the ones who have that smile and it's all about their mouth and not about their eyes.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the eye contact, that eye contact is always good. But I know there are people that must have just taken a course on eye contact, and all they're doing is staring at you the whole time, and they start to invade on your personal space because they're staring. So tell me the difference between optimal eye contact and too much.
Yeah, so it's an emerging field of research, to say the least, and it's one that it's hard to kind of tackle, because if you're looking away too much, obviously it's not good, but if you're staring right at someone the entire time, also obviously not good. So me personally, I like to stick with what I'll call an 80-20 rule. So I think eye contact about 80% of the time is the best sort of approach, whereas dropping eye contact about 20% of the time is going to make people feel comfortable. So there's definitely this fine line you need to walk between staring at somebody and maintaining eye contact.
And I often talk to people about giving them a break, giving your conversational partner a break, and sometimes looking away, but a good time to look away might be when you're not talking. Like for a moment, break eye contact.
Absolutely.
And then come back and look at them. So when it's important, eye contact is critical, but you need to give your partner a little bit of a break or they feel invaded. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think something else that comes into play, as we were talking about linking nonverbal behavior to verbal behavior, is you can use times to look away, and then when you're trying to make your final point, that's when you're going to want to re-engage with eye contact.
Absolutely.
So using it as a tool, not only as something that exists in a conversation, but actually using it to guide your points and really give a good, strong take-home message to your vocal or verbal behaviors.
And I want to come back to something, because you were talking about the head tilt, and we spoke only about the axis up and down.
Sure.
What do you think about the head tilt? Because I've dealt with this with a lot of clients and had a lot of discussions about the power of speaking this way and speaking this way. What are your thoughts about it?
So there isn't much on it, to my knowledge. So the movement you're talking about is something called head roll rotation, opposed to head pitch rotation. But what I have seen is it can also increase perceptions of affiliativeness and warmth. But other than that, from my experience with it, I haven't seen too much.
Oh, and that's interesting, because I've often thought that tilting your head takes away some power. And again, I'm not using research for this. But speaking with many of my clients, they've told me that they use that as a listening behavior. And it makes a lot of sense, because you're taking away some power by looking less strong with the head tilted to the side, and it may make somebody feel more comfortable.
Sure.
So I often coach my clients to be mindful of what you can communicate. It doesn't mean there's a right or wrong, because certain situations dictate looking very powerful and prestigious, and maybe when you're speaking to your manager or certain situations, you may not want to be the person of power and choose to have maybe low power postures. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So, recognizing your part, I like to talk of it in terms of social hierarchies, which it seems a bit removed when you're talking about social interactions, but it's actually pivotally important. And recognizing your position in a social hierarchy is absolutely central. So, for example, if you're talking to a boss and you're trying to come across as like a high-ranking person, this can sometimes be good because it can make them want to promote you, but also it can be threatening, and it can definitely have lead to some issues. So knowing when to signal your social rank versus knowing when to be more submissive is very important for maintaining comfortable power dynamics.
An interesting thing, a client once said to me that her boss said to her, she walked into the room to talk to him, and she was kneeling down to be at eye level. And he said to her, never kneel down at eye level. Both stand up and talk. But she made herself seem so much weaker by kneeling to the ground to speak with somebody. And I guess by the same token, you don't want to always be looking up to talk to somebody. If you're seated, you should stand up to meet at eye level.
Yeah, people, physical space, right? Just the way that you interact with someone, whether it's they're above you, below you, it also has a lot of implications for power dynamics. I think this is one of the reasons you see that people go on stages, for example, when they're giving talks. Even the concept of looking up at people, it communicates power. So there's actually some very interesting research showing that where you are in physical space does have these direct implications you're talking about for power dynamics. And I would absolutely agree that kneeling down or putting yourself below somebody is going to be detrimental to the interaction. One thing that I do think is important, though, is, again, recognizing where someone is in relation to you and not necessarily kneeling down so you're below them, but also not hovering above someone who's a more powerful person than you. This could be very off-putting.
And then you get to the physical space of how close do you get to somebody and observe, especially I work with people from many different cultures. The physical space becomes an issue if you're too close for comfort, and if somebody is backing off, observe that and don't keep getting closer.
Absolutely, and it's one of those things that's hard to pick up on. So not only is physical space very important. So, for example, hostile people get very angry and can become aggressive if you get too close to their bubble. So you see actually a lot of research on prisons going on about this. But in addition to that, the amount of physical space that someone wants is not only going to vary from person to person, but it's going to drastically vary from culture to culture. So especially in Eastern cultures, you see very different space dynamics than you see here in the West, which makes it hard to understand what the social norms are until you've actually integrated yourself with different people and different cultures to understand what's best.
And in the world, the real world and the workplace, it is very diverse. So we constantly have to be on the lookout for different reactions and observe people. This leads me to another approach that I deal with my clients, and that is the OLE approach of communication, standing for the O is observe, the L is listen, and the E is engage. So we've been talking so far about how you send out information and how you have that professional presence, or how you can look prestigious and knowledgeable. And a lot of that we're talking about visually. But the other part is when we have an interchange, of course we're always looking at the other person and trying to perceive what they're doing and what they are by how they look, how they sound, and what they say. So it's really a two-way street. It's a feedback loop, right? We send out information and we want to observe and receive it. I'm assuming this relates very well to what we were talking about already with the nonverbal communication.
Absolutely. So, the way we form impressions, it's automatic. So we do it whether we want to or not. It happens spontaneously. So without any sort of conscious awareness, the second we see a face, we're immediately starting to form perceptions about the person, whether it's any background information we might have about them. And we use these impressions to drive everything from our behaviors towards them, so our social interactions, but also any sort of behaviors that we'd engage, such as like aggressiveness, whether we want to completely disregard them. So the way we perceive someone not only has implications for, what we perceive, but it also has extremely large implications for our behavior.
And I know you know a lot of research, but I always hear people quote maybe 7 seconds for the first impression. And I've always said 4 seconds. But I know there was a study in Princeton that said, I think it was 1/10 of a second that you look at a face and you form an impression.
Yeah, so we extract information such as gender, race, instantly. So definitely less than a second. And we have a lot of sort of predisposed inferences that we draw based on these things. And as a result of that, we do form impressions of people incredibly quickly.
So there's a lot of challenges that when we get out to meet people, they're forming an impression of us immediately, and we want to send out the best impression that we could. This leads me to another area of expertise that I have, and that is the vocal piece, how you sound. And with vocal, I mean everything from, do you project your voice? Do you speak in monotone? Do you have variety in the way you speak? Are you pronouncing words clearly? Do you have an accent? All of these vocal aspects, as well as the uptalk, that's often very common when people talk and they raise their pitch when they're speaking, or just speaking at the bottom of their pitch range. I believe vocal is critical, and I do a lot of work as a speech and language pathologist in helping people modify their voice. But I know there is some research on some of the nonverbal. You had mentioned to me before about vocal, and I know that's not your primary area, but I know you know something about that. So what can you share with us?
Sure. So one of the things that's actually coming out of our lab very recently is we're finding that people who are dominant individuals, so individuals who use aggression and intimidation to elicit fear. So, for example, imagine you're working in a group with someone and there's a person in the group you just don't want to fight back with. It's not worth the energy, it's not worth the time, so you just let them have their way. So this would be an example of a person who rises to the top based on dominance. So we see dominant individuals, they tend to decrease their vocal pitch over time. So you'll hear that throughout the course of an interaction, the actual tone of their voice will go down. So this varies a bit from prestige. But that said, even generally speaking, as you're starting to talk about uptalk, one of the things that I think is most interesting about that is that's how we tend to finalize questions. So by continuing to use uptalk to end each sentence, you're kind of leaving the listener waiting for more and waiting for more and waiting for more, and they're going to probably be unsatisfied by the end of whatever you're telling them. So.
Or they don't sound confident in what they're saying. And that's often what I say. With the uptalk, it could be, I'm not finished, I have something more to say, but it also makes it sound like I'm not as confident. And some people even say they use that uptalk in a meeting so people know that they're not done and they don't get interrupted, but they don't sound as powerful. So I think we need to balance and know when there may be times to use it, but there may be repercussions. If you introduce yourself and you say, hi, I'm Linda Wilner, I don't sound sure of myself. And what type of impression am I making there?
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons that people are going to sound like they're lacking confidence is because when we're asking questions, that's one of the situations where we tend to not know what we're talking about. So by ending each question, or excuse me, by ending each statement with a question, we make it clear that we're not really sure what we're saying, even though we're verbally saying that we know what we're talking about.
And so your tone of voice does become very important as far as exuding confidence and maybe even power. And you mentioned something about the lower tone, or there are some people who speak very quietly, and by doing that, they're pulling people in. And that is somewhat of a control, maybe not positive, but it makes them appear maybe knowledgeable, but you have to get real close to me to hear what I'm saying. And so you have to be cautious on what image you're projecting when you change the tone, when you change the loudness, when you change the inflection. Zach, these are great tips. I love getting the research behind the work that I do that reinforces what I'm doing as well. Is there anything else that we didn't approach that is an area for you? I don't think you work as much with the gestures. I know that's always the question people ask me. What do I do with my hands? Do you know, I don't think that's your area, is it?
So it's not my area, but I can say this. So in terms of gesturing, going back to what we were saying earlier, it's like extremely important to match your gestures to what you're actually saying. So even the way that like to what you're actually saying, how I chop down on every sort of lower intonation that I hit, being able to match what you're saying to what you're doing will help you communicate your message, undoubtedly. So there's a large area of research on something called immediacy behaviors. So these focus on ways that can help you communicate to others. So there's a lot of research currently, especially in education, on teachers trying to show the nonverbal behaviors that help them communicate the actual lesson plans to their students. And the key themes on this research is it's essentially saying smiling is extremely important. You see a lot of head nodding, as we do right now, because it shows you're engaged in the conversation. So between smiling, head nodding, and also gesturing is very important for immediacy too. So being able to use your body to bring people in and not just be a stone wall standing there with a mouth that's speaking, it will definitely help you communicate your message.
Or take your hands out of your pockets because you can more naturally gesture. Or you don't want to have the distracting gestures that take away from your message, but gestures, and I think our brain lets us gesture if we just relax our hands and don't worry what to do with them all the time, that we'll more naturally gesture.
Absolutely. As long as they're not in your pockets, definitely leave hands out of pockets.
Right. And don't jingle the change or keys that are in your pockets. It definitely will distract your audience. Well, Zach, we can talk for hours about this. I know we have. I love the background of what you're working in because it's so critical, and people always ask questions about this, but the most important thing is we do need research behind our premises. It shouldn't just be, we think this works. And so it's great to always hear that what you're doing in research is consistent with the things that I'm trying to teach the clients that I work with. So I thank you for joining me today, and this was a great interview.